Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I think that any sensible debate requires precise phenomenon definitions. And so, at the outset, it is important to ask ourselves why the topic of Central European cooperation arises at all, how it is understood by individual global players, and what it means for us who live in Central Europe and consider it our home. I am glad to be able to present here in Sofia a global political reflection on the topic of Central Europe, which was presented originally by my colleague, Ambassador Petr Pelz, a political scientist and the former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. At the presentation of our joint project before the ambassadors of 7 Central European countries in the Břevnov Monastery in Prague in May 2023. When we talk about Central Europe from a global political point of view, it is probably appropriate to attempt to define it first. We in our Central Association are working with a definition of Central Europe, which is perhaps a bit broader than usual definitions. Because today, when talking about Central Europe, such a common political understanding is that it means Visegrad cooperation. The Visegrad cooperation is a huge result of the diplomacy of Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Slovakia after 1989. And we hope that despite current disagreements, we will be able to preserve it, that it will flourish, because it has accomplished many things and it has proven itself. However, in the future we need a project that will be even more ambitious than Visegrad cooperation. It will be more ambitious both geographically and politically and functionally too. From a geographical point of view, we are talking about a whole that can be defined either by 3 rivers or 3 seas. The 3 rivers are the Danube, Elbe and Vltava rivers. The 3 rivers define Central Europe, and the 3 seas are the Baltic, Black and Adriatic seas. This means that our home, Central Europe, as we understand it, includes not only the 4 Visegrad states, but also extends into the territory we call the Balkans. Slovakian countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, equally important for our project. However, if we are to capture the spirit of Central Europe, I like to use a different definition. It is therefore neither from some other web nor from the maps. It is from the famous Czech writer who lived in exile in Paris for many years, Milan Kundera. By the way, he headed the Department of Central Europe at the Sorbonne University. He presented several definitions of Central Europe, and I like the one that is not so well known, and that says that Central Europe is a maximum of diversity in a minimum of space. I would like myself to add one definition of my own. Central Europe is a state of soul and heart more precisely. It's the spirit of variety that still holds it together. Of course, diversity is often a recipe for things to fall apart, to break up. But the fact that Central Europe is defined by diversity means that despite that diversity, there must be certain things that internally do connect that diversity together. I think that our task in the future is to protect this Central European variety from any uniformity. That's why we were unsatisfied until 1989. And that's why Milan Kundera actually wrote another essay and a different definition of Central Europe at that time, when he said that Central Europe is abducted West. The West that had been embraced into the Soviet Empire by historical development. What brought it, of course, was the uniformity that came from the East. The fact that the Central European peoples could not live according to their own will. And that great, I would say, performance, the liberation of 1989 and 1990, brought out the possibility of autonomous evolution, the very possibility of diversity. We seized that opportunity as best as we were able to. We did what we could, and we succeeded in many of those things after 1990. I think that at that time, it was quite natural that we were heading towards the European Union. We were heading towards NATO. We kept inviting foreign capital to help rebuild our economies. All this made an amount of sense in the 90s, indeed. Nevertheless, today, when we see the results, a critical reflection is in order. Today, we face a peculiar situation of what to do as the West turns away from itself. Not only does it turn away from us sometimes, which would not be so serious. It might be possible to work with it diplomatically and strategically. But we are in a situation where the West is really turning away from itself. The West is losing its value and cultural identity, and the European Union is going through an obvious crisis. Concurrently, the attitude of the new American administration opens a serious debate about the future role of the USA in Europe and the impact of these changes on the real activity of NATO. And we must ponder how to proceed. What to preserve from Western heritage. I would say that it is a legacy that we do not choose pragmatically. We simply are it. This is not something we can either choose and want to be or not. It is just in us. And we must try to preserve it, often despite today's West, or better said, regardless of those who claim to represent the West today. I think that it is more accurate wording. Therefore, the issue of Central Europe is even more relevant today than in the 1990s. In the 90s, we kind of forgot about Central Europe because we looked west, to Berlin, to Brussels, to Washington. But today, we have to ask ourselves what to do next, because we see that in some aspects, we are facing threats that do not come from the East, but precisely from the West. There is a real progressive ideological threat here. One could certainly talk about this for a very long time. For all descriptions, it is enough to say only three terms. There are mentioned here already: Green Deal, Istanbul Convention, Council and woke culture. This is something we do not want in Central Europe. And in addition to the value moment, there is also an economic moment. We sought cooperation, equal economic cooperation. We sought prosperity. Our image of the West was motivated by this, certainly not by becoming an economic colony from which it fed dividends of further transfer prices will flow away every year, which will freeze us in the situation of suppliers of cheap labor. This wasn't the idea of the 90s. Another important issue raising doubts is an item from the broader security portfolio. I remember that time in the 90s, before joining the EU, when we discussed visa-free relations with Germany. The German condition at that time was that no migrants from the Balkans would come to us from you. You have to look after that, they said. This must work. And we thought to ourselves, they are probably right. That is logical. Borders define a state. That is how it's always been. No one disputed that. And suddenly, some 20 years ago, we hear that Europe actually has no borders and that whoever defends their own border against migration is actually not a good European. By contrast, it doesn't make sense. Here again comes something that the West did not represent in the 1990s. Today, this suddenly becomes a mantra, pseudo-value that is European, eternal, unquestionable. No, it makes no sense. Even the unfortunate development in Ukraine, literally the Ukrainian tragedy, shows how the security system in Europe, set up both after World War II and after the fall of the Iron Curtain, has failed. It was a senseless tragedy. In this, one must agree with the current American President, Donald Trump. Therefore, it is necessary for us all to start thinking about the issues that affect us independently. Don't wait for Central Europe to be redesigned for us on the distant drawing boards. And again, it doesn't matter whether in Brussels, in Washington, in Moscow, in Beijing, in Istanbul, or wherever elsewhere. We don't want such a Central Europe. We want a Central Europe that we will create together, we Central Europeans. The Central Europe, which we know is returning to those values we have always had here, which we deem the heritage of classical antiquity and Christianity, which we call Western, even if Brussels and London do not consider Western anymore. Central Europe that shall give us prosperity. Central Europe that shall augment peace. Central Europe that shall allow nation states and their peoples to live their sovereign existence. Thank you for attention.